The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. After appointing Sallust governor of Numidia and reorganizing the provinces of Africa, Caesar in the fall of 46 returned to Rome. The frightened Senate, recognizing the advent of monarchy, voted him the dictatorship for 10 years, and such a triumph as Rome had never seen before. He paid each of his soldiers 5,000 Attic drachmas, or $3,000, much more than he had promised them. He feasted the citizens at 22,000 tables, and for their amusement provided a sham sea battle involving 10,000 men. Early in 45 he left for Spain, and at Munda defeated the last Pompeian army. When in October he reached Rome, he found all Italy in chaos. Oligarchic misrule and a century of revolution had disorganized agriculture, industry, finance, and trade. The exhaustion of the provinces, the hoarding of capital, and the precariousness of investment had disturbed the flow of money. Thousands of estates had fallen into ruin. 100,000 men had been drawn from production into war. Peasants beyond number had been driven by the competition of foreign grain or latifundia slaves to join the proletariat in the towns and listen hungrily to promising demagogues. The surviving aristocracy, unmelted by Caesar's clemency, plotted against him in their clubs and palaces. He appealed to them in the Senate to recognize the necessity of dictatorship and to cooperate with him in a healing reconstruction. They scorned the advances of the usurper, denounced the presence of Cleopatra as his guest in Rome, and whispered that he was planning to make himself king and move the seat of the empire to Alexandria or Ilium. Caesar alone, therefore, though prematurely old at 55, set himself with Roman energy to remake the Roman state. He knew that his victories would be meaningless if he could not build something better than the wreckage that he had cleared away. When in 44 his dictatorship for 10 years was extended for life, he did not much exaggerate the difference, though he could hardly foresee that in 5 months he would be dead. The Senate heaped adulation and titles upon him, perhaps to make him odious to a people that hated the very name of king. It let him wear the laurel wreath, with which he hid his baldness, and carry even in peace the imperator's powers. Through these he controlled the treasury, and as Pontifex Maximus, the priesthoods. As consul he could propose and execute laws. As tribune his person was inviolable. As censor he could make or unmake senators. The assemblies kept the right to vote on proposed measures, but Caesar's lieutenants, Dolabella and Antony, managed the assemblies, which in general favored his policies. Like other dictators, he sought to base his power upon popularity with the people. He subordinated the Senate almost to the role of an advisory council. He enlarged it from 600 to 900 members and permanently transformed it with 400 new appointees. Many of these were Roman businessmen. Many were leading citizens of Italian or provincial cities. Some had been centurions, soldiers, or sons of slaves. The patricians were alarmed to see the chieftains of conquered Gaul enter the Senate and join the rulers of the empire. Even the wags of the capital resented this and circulated a satiric couplet. Gallos Caesar in triumphum ducit, idem in curiam. Galli brachas depusuerunt, latum clavum sumpserunt. Caesar leads Gauls in his triumph, then into the Senate. The Gauls have removed their breeches and put on the broad-rimmed toga of the senators. Perhaps Caesar purposely made the new Senate too cumbersome a body for effective deliberation or unified opposition. He chose a group of friends, Balbus, Appius, Macius, and others, as an informal executive cabinet, and inaugurated the bureaucracy of the empire by delegating the clerical details of his government and the minutiae of administration to his household of freedmen and slaves. He allowed the assembly to elect half the city magistrates. He chose the rest by recommendations, which the assembly regularly approved. As tribune, he could veto the decisions of other tribunes or consuls. He increased the praetors to 16 and the quaestors to 40 to expedite municipal and judicial business. He kept a personal eye on every aspect of the city's affairs and tolerated no incompetence or waste. In the city charters that he granted, he placed severe injunctions and penalties against electoral corruption and official malfeasance. To end the domination of politics by organized vote-buying, and perhaps to secure his power against proletarian revolt, he abolished the collegia, except some of ancient origin, and the essentially religious associations of the Jews. He restricted jury service to the 2 upper classes and reserved for himself the right to try the most vital cases. Frequently he sat as judge, and none could deny the wisdom and impartiality of his decisions. He proposed to the jurists of his time an orderly codification of existing Roman law, but his early death frustrated the plan. Resuming the work of the Gracchi, he distributed lands to his veterans and the poor. This policy, continued by Augustus, for many years pacified the agrarian agitation. To forestall the rapid reconcentration of land ownership, he ruled that the new lands could not be sold within 20 years, and to check rural slavery he passed a measure requiring that a third of the laborers on ranches should be freemen. Having turned many idle proletaires into soldiers and then into peasant proprietors, he further diminished their ranks by sending 80,000 citizens as colonists to Carthage, Corinth, Seville, Arles, and other centers. To provide work for the remaining unemployed in Rome, he spent 160 million sesterces in a great building program. He had a new and more spacious meeting place for the assemblies set up in the Field of Mars, and relieved the congestion of business in the Forum by adding near it a Forum Iulium. He embellished likewise many cities in Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Greece. Having so eased the pressure of poverty, he required a means test for eligibility to the state dole of grain. At once the number of applicants fell from 320,000 to 150,000. So far he had remained true to his role as a champion of the populares. But since the Roman Revolution was more agrarian than industrial, and was aimed chiefly at the landed, slave-driving aristocracy, then at the moneylenders, and only mildly at the business classes, Caesar continued the Graccan policy of inviting businessmen to support the agrarian and fiscal revolution. Cicero sought to unite the middle classes with the aristocracy. Caesar sought to unite them with the plebs. Many of the great capitalists, from Crassus to Balbus, helped to finance him, as similar men helped the American and French revolutions. Nevertheless, Caesar ended one of the richest sources of financial profiteering, the collection of provincial taxes through corporations of publicans. He scaled down debts, enacted severe laws against excessive interest rates, and relieved extreme cases of insolvency by establishing the law of bankruptcy essentially as it stands today. He restored the stability of the currency by basing it upon gold and issuing a golden aureus, equivalent in purchasing power to the British pound sterling in the 19th century. The coins of his government were stamped with his own features and were designed with an artistry new to Rome. A novel order and competence entered the administration of the empire's finances, with the result that when Caesar died, the treasury contained 700 million sesterces, and his private treasury 100 million. As a scientific basis for taxation and administration, he had a census taken of Italy and planned a like census of the empire. To replenish a citizenry decimated by war, he granted the Roman franchise widely, among others to physicians and teachers in Rome. Long disturbed by the fall in the birth rate, he had in 59 given precedence in land allotments to fathers of 3 children. Now he promulgated rewards for large families and forbade childless women under 45 to ride in litters or wear jewelry, the weakest and most futile part of his varied legislation. Still an agnostic, though not quite free from superstitions, Caesar remained high priest of the state religion and provided it with the usual funds. He restored old temples and built new ones, honoring above all his alma mater, Venus. But he allowed full liberty of conscience and worship, withdrew old prohibitions against the Isis cult, and protected the Jews in the exercise of their faith. Noting that the calendar of the priests had lost all concord with the seasons, he commissioned the Alexandrian Greek Sosigenes to devise, on Egyptian models, the Julian calendar. Henceforth, the year was to consist of 365 days, with an added day every 4th February. Cicero complained that Caesar, not content with ruling the earth, was now regulating the stars, but the Senate accepted the reform graciously and gave the dictator's family name, Julius, to the month Quintilis, which had been 5th when March opened the year. As impressive as these things done are the works begun or planned by Caesar but postponed by his assassination. He laid the foundations of a great theater and of a temple to Mars proportioned to that god's voracity. He appointed Varro to head an organization for the establishment of public libraries. He designed to free Rome from malaria by draining Lake Fucinus and the Pontine marshes, and reclaiming these acres for tillage. He proposed to raise dikes to control the Tiber's floods. By diverting the course of that stream, he hoped to improve the harbor at Ostia, periodically ruined by the river's silt. He instructed his engineers to prepare plans for building a road across central Italy and for cutting a canal at Corinth. The most resented of his undertakings was to make the freemen of Italy equal citizens with those of Rome, and the provinces ultimately equal with Italy. In 49 he had enfranchised Cisalpine Gaul. Now in 44 he drew up a municipal charter apparently for all the cities of Italy, equalizing their rights with Rome's. Probably he was planning some representative government by which they would have a democratic share in his constitutional monarchy. He took the appointment of provincial governors out of the hands of the corrupt Senate, and himself named to these posts men of proved ability, who remained at every moment subject to recall at his will. He reduced provincial taxes by a third, and entrusted their collection to special officials responsible to himself. He overrode ancient curses to restore Capua, Carthage, and Corinth, completing again the work of the Gracchi. To the colonists whom he sent to found or people a score of cities from Gibraltar to the Black Sea, he gave Roman or Latin rights and evidently hoped to extend Roman citizenship to all free adult males in the empire. The Senate was then to represent not a class in Rome, but the mind and will of every province. This conception of government, and Caesar's reorganization of Rome and Italy, completed the miracle whereby the youthful spendthrift and roisterer had become one of the ablest, bravest, fairest, and most enlightened men in all the sorry annals of politics. Like Alexander, he did not know where to stop. Contemplating his reordered realm, he resented its exposure to attack at the Euphrates, the Danube, and the Rhine. He dreamed of a great expedition to capture Parthia and avenge his old pocketbook Crassus, of a march around the Black Sea and the pacification of Scythia, of the exploration of the Danube and the conquest of Germany. Then, having made the empire secure, he would return to Rome laden with honor and spoils, rich enough to end economic depression, powerful enough to ignore all opposition, free at last to name his successor and to die with the Pax Romana as his supreme legacy to the world. 9. Brutus. When news of this plan trickled through Rome, the common people, who loved glory, applauded. The business classes, smelling war orders and provincial loot, licked their chops. The aristocracy, foreseeing its extinction on Caesar's return, resolved to kill him before he could go. He had treated these blue bloods with such generosity as to stir Cicero's eloquence in his praise. He had forgiven all surrendering foes and had condemned to death only a few officers who, defeated and pardoned, had fought against him again. He had burned unread the correspondence he had found in the tents of Pompey and Scipio. He had sent the captured daughter and grandchildren of Pompey to Pompey's son Sextus, who was still in arms against him, and he had restored the statues of Pompey which his followers had thrown down. He had given provincial governorships to Brutus and Cassius, and high office to many others of their class. He bore silently 1,000 slanders, and instituted no proceedings against those whom he suspected of plotting against his life. To Cicero, who had trimmed his wind to every sail, he offered not only pardon but honor, and refused nothing that the orator asked for himself or his Pompeian friends. He even forgave, at Cicero's urging, the unrepentant Marcus Marcellus. In a pretty speech for Marcellus, in 46, Cicero acclaimed Caesar's unbelievable liberality, and admitted that Pompey, victorious, would have been more vengeful. "I have heard with regret," he said, "your celebrated and highly philosophical remark, Jam satis vixi. I have lived enough, whether for nature or for fame. Put aside, I beg you, that wisdom of the sage. Do not be wise at the cost of our peril. You are still far from the completion of your greatest labors. You have not yet laid their foundations." And he solemnly promised Caesar, in the name of all the Senate, that they would watch over his safety and oppose with their own bodies any attack upon him. Cicero now prospered so well that he planned to buy still another palace, no less than that of Sulla himself. He enjoyed the dinners to which he was invited by Antony, Balbus, and others of Caesar's aides. Never before had his letters been so gay. Caesar was not deceived. He wrote to Macius, "If anyone is gracious, it is Cicero, but I doubt not that he hates me bitterly." When reassured Pompeians resumed their opposition, this unctuous Talleyrand of the pen fell in with their hopes and wrote a eulogy of the younger Cato that should have put Caesar on his guard. Caesar contented himself with writing a reply, the anti-Cato, which did not show the dictator at his best. In this duel he had given Cicero the choice of weapons, and the orator had won. Public opinion praised Cicero's style and the mildness of a ruler who composed a pamphlet when he might have signed a death warrant. Men who have been deprived of wanted power cannot be mollified by pardoning their resistance. It is as difficult to forgive forgiveness as it is to forgive those whom we have injured. The aristocrats fretted in a Senate that dared not reject the proposals that Caesar so constitutionally submitted to them. They patriotically denounced the destruction of a liberty that had fattened their purses, and would not admit that the restoration of order required the limitation of their freedom. They looked with horror upon the presence of Cleopatra and Caesarion in Rome. It was true that Caesar was living with his wife Calpurnia, apparently in mutual affection, but who could say, who would not say, what happened on his frequent visits to the gorgeous queen? Rumors persisted that he would make himself king, marry her, and place the capital of their united empires in the east. Had he not ordered his statue to be erected on the Capitol next to those of Rome's ancient kings? Had he not stamped his own image upon Roman coins, an unprecedented insolence? Did he not wear robes of purple, usually reserved for kings? At the Lupercalia, on February 15, 44, the consul Antony, sacerdotally naked and impiously drunk, tried thrice to place a royal crown upon Caesar's head. Thrice Caesar refused. But was it not because the crowd murmured disapproval? Did he not dismiss from office the tribunes who removed from his statue the royal diadem placed upon it by his friends? When the Senate approached him as he sat in the temple of Venus, he did not rise to receive them. Some explained that he had been overcome by an epileptic stroke, others that he was suffering from diarrhea and had remained seated to avoid a movement of his bowels at so unpropitious a moment. But many patricians feared that any day might see him proclaimed a king. Shortly after the Lupercalia, Gaius Cassius, a sickly man, pale and lean as Plutarch describes him, approached Marcus Brutus and suggested the assassination of Caesar. He had already won to his plan several senators, some capitalists whose provincial pillage had fallen with Caesar's restriction of the publicans, and even some of Caesar's generals, who felt that the spoils and offices awarded them had not quite equaled their deserts. Brutus was needed as the front of the conspiracy, for he had won a wide reputation as the most virtuous of men. He was supposedly descended from the Brutus who had expelled the kings 464 years before. His mother, Servilia, was Cato's half-sister. His wife, Portia, was Cato's daughter, and the widow of Caesar's enemy Bibulus. It was thought, says Appian, that Brutus was Caesar's son, as Caesar was the lover of Servilia about the time of Brutus's birth. Plutarch adds that Caesar believed Brutus to be his son. Possibly Brutus himself shared this opinion, and hated the dictator for having seduced his mother and made him, in the gossip of Rome, a bastard instead of a Brutus. He had always been moody and taciturn, as if brooding over a secret wrong. At the same time, he carried himself proudly, as one who in any case bore noble blood in his veins. He was a master of Greek and a devotee of philosophy, in metaphysics a follower of Plato, in ethics of Zeno. It was not lost upon him that Stoicism, like Greek and Roman opinion, approved tyrannicide. Our ancestors, he wrote to a friend, thought that we ought not to endure a tyrant even if he were our own father. He composed a treatise on virtue and was later confused with that abstraction. Through intermediaries he lent money at 48% to the citizens of Cyprian Salamis. When they balked at paying the accumulated interest, he urged Cicero, then proconsul in Cilicia, to enforce the collection with Roman arms. He governed Cisalpine Gaul with integrity and competence, and returning to Rome, was made urban praetor by Caesar. This in 45. Every generous element in his nature rebelled against Cassius's proposal. Cassius reminded him of his rebel ancestry, and perhaps Brutus felt challenged to prove it by imitation. The sensitive youth blushed when he saw affixed to statues of the older Brutus such inscriptions as, "Brutus, are you dead?" or "Your posterity is unworthy of you." Cicero dedicated to him several treatises written in these years. Meanwhile, it was whispered among the patricians that at the next meeting of the Senate on March 15th, Lucius Cotta would move that Caesar be made king, on the ground that according to the Sibylline oracle the Parthians would be conquered only by a king. A Senate half filled with Caesar's appointees, said Cassius, would pass the measure, and all hope of restoring the Republic would be lost. Brutus yielded, and the conspirators then made definite plans. Portia drew the secret from her husband by stabbing her thigh to show that no physical injury could make her speak against her will. In a moment of unprophetic sentiment, Brutus insisted that Antony should be spared. On the evening of March 14th, to a gathering at his home, Caesar proposed as a topic of conversation, "What is the best death?" His own answer was, "A sudden one." The next morning his wife begged him not to go to the Senate, saying that she had dreamed of seeing him covered with blood. A like-minded servant sought to provide a deterrent omen by causing an ancestral picture to fall from the wall. But Decimus Brutus, who was one of his closest friends and was also one of the conspirators, urged him to attend the Senate if only to adjourn it courteously in person. A friend who had learned of the plot came to warn him, but Caesar had already left. On his way to the Senate he met a soothsayer who had once whispered to him, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar remarked smiling that the Ides had come and all was well. "But they have not passed," answered Spurinna. While Caesar was offering the usual pre-session sacrifice before Pompey's theater, where the Senate was to meet, a tablet informing him of the conspiracy was put into his hands. He ignored it, and tradition says that it was found in his hand after his death. These stories of the Ides of March appear in Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian, but they may be legend nevertheless. Trebonius, a conspirator who had been a favored general of Caesar, detained Antony from the meeting by conversation. When Caesar entered the theater and took his seat, the liberators flung themselves upon him without delay. Some have written, reports Suetonius, that when Marcus Brutus rushed at him, he said in Greek, "Kai su teknon, you too, my child?" When Brutus struck him, says Appian, Caesar ended all resistance. Drawing his robe over his face and head, he submitted to the blows and fell at the foot of Pompey's statue. One wish had been granted to the most complete man that antiquity produced. Chapter 10. Antony, 44 to 30 B.C. 1. Antony and Brutus. The assassination of Caesar was one of the major tragedies of history, not merely in the sense that it interrupted a great labor of statesmanship and led to 15 years more of chaos and war. Civilization survived, and Augustus completed what Caesar had begun. It was a tragedy also in the sense that probably both parties were right. The conspirators in thinking that Caesar meditated monarchy, Caesar in thinking that disorder and empire had made monarchy inevitable. Men have divided on the issue ever since the Senate sat for a moment in consternation at the deed, and then fled in tumult and terror from the hall. Antony, arriving after the event, saw valor in discretion and fortified himself in his house. Cicero's eloquence lost its tongue, even when Brutus, dagger in hand, hailed him as father of his country. Emerging, the conspirators found an excited populace in the square. They tried to win it with catchwords of liberty and the republic, but the dazed crowd had no homage for phrases so long used to cover greed. Fearing for their lives, the assassins took refuge in the buildings on the Capitol and surrounded themselves there with their personal gladiatorial guards. Toward evening, Cicero joined them. Antony, approached by their emissaries, sent a friendly reply. The next day, a larger crowd gathered in the Forum. The conspirators sent agents to buy its support and organize it into a legal assembly. Then they ventured down from the Capitol, and Brutus delivered an oration which he had prepared for the Senate. The speech failed to move its hearers. Cassius tried and was met with cold silence. The liberators returned to the Capitol, and as the crowd thinned out, they stealthily departed to their homes. Antony, thinking himself Caesar's heir, obtained from the stunned Calpurnia all the papers and funds that the dictator had left in his palace. At the same time, he secretly summoned Caesar's veterans to Rome. On the 17th, by his authority as tribune, he convened the Senate and astonished all parties by his amiability and calm. He accepted Cicero's proposal for a general amnesty and agreed that Brutus and Cassius should receive provincial governorships, that is, flight with safety and power, on condition that the Senate should ratify all the decrees, legislation, and appointments of Caesar. Since a majority of the Senate owed office or emoluments to these acts, it consented. And when it adjourned, Antony was acclaimed as a statesman who had snatched peace out of the jaws of war. That evening he entertained Cassius for dinner. On the 18th, the Senate met again, recognized Caesar's will, voted him a public funeral, and appointed Antony to deliver the customary eulogy. On the 19th, Antony secured the will from the Vestal Virgins, with whom it had been deposited, and read it first to a small, then to a larger gathering. It bequeathed Caesar's private fortune to 3 grandnephews and, to the astonishment and anger of Antony, named one of them, Caius Octavius, as adoptive son and heir. The dictator had devised his gardens to the people as a public park, and had left 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome. The news of these benefactions sped through the city, and when on the 20th Caesar's body, which had been embalmed in his home, was brought into the Forum for the last rites, a great concourse of people, including Caesar's veterans, gathered to do him reverence. Antony seems to have spoken at first with cautious restraint, but as he went on, his pent-up feelings flared into eloquence. When he raised from the ivory bier the torn and bloody robe through which Caesar had been stabbed, the emotions of the crowd were stirred beyond control. Amid weird wailing and frenzied cries, men gathered wood anywhere and built a fire beneath the corpse. Veterans threw their weapons upon the pyre as an offering, actors threw their costumes, musicians their instruments, women their most precious ornaments. Taking brands from the fire, some enthusiasts sought to burn down the houses of the conspirators, but these buildings were well guarded, and their masters had fled from Rome. A large part of the crowd stayed all night long by the smoldering pyre. Many Jews, grateful for Caesar's sympathetic legislation, remained there 3 days, intoning their ancient funeral chants. During those days, riots surged through the capital. At last, Antony directed his soldiers to restore order and to fling persistent marauders from the Tarpeian Rock. Antony was one half of what Caesar had been, as Augustus would be the other half. Antony was a good general, Augustus a superlative statesman. Neither would be both. Born in 82 B.C., Antony had spent a large part of his life in camps and more in quest of wine, women, good food, and fun. Though of high lineage and handsome features, he had the characteristic virtues of the common man: strength of body, animal spirits, good nature, generosity, courage, and loyalty. He had scandalized even Caesar by keeping a harem of both sexes in Rome and traveling with a Greek courtesan in his litter. He had bought in Pompey's house at auction, occupied it, and then refused payment. Now he found in Caesar's papers, or some said placed there, whatever it suited him to find: appointments for his friends, decrees for his purposes, perquisites for himself. In 2 weeks' time he had paid off $1,500,000 in debts and had become a rich man. He seized the $25 million that Caesar had deposited in the temple of Alps and took another $5 million from Caesar's private treasury. Noting that Decimus Brutus, whom Caesar had appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, had assumed that lucrative office despite sharing in the assassination of Caesar, Antony passed through the assembly a bill giving himself that strategic province and consoling Decimus with Macedonia. Likewise, Marcus Brutus and Cassius were to surrender Macedonia to Decimus and Syria to Dolabella, and were to content themselves with sharing Cyrene and Crete. Alarmed by Antony's spreading power, the Senate invited to Rome, as a foil to him, Caesar's adopted son. Caius Octavius, who was to make himself the great statesman in Roman history, was 18 years old in 44. By natural custom, he took his adoptive father's name. Adding his own as a modifier, he became Caius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Until 17 years later, he received that lofty name of Augustus by which the centuries have known him. His grandmother was Caesar's sister Julia. His grandfather had been a banker of plebeian stock at Velletri in Latium. His father had served as plebeian aedile, then praetor, then governor of Macedonia. The boy was trained to Spartan simplicity and educated in the literature and philosophy of Greece and Rome. In the last 3 years he had lived a good part of the time in Caesar's palace. It was one of the sorrows of Caesar's life that he had no legitimate son, and one of his profoundest insights that he adopted Octavius. He took the boy with him to Spain in 45 and was pleased to see the courage with which the frail and nervous invalid endured the perils and hardships of the campaign. He had him carefully instructed in the arts of war and government. Many statues have made his features familiar: refined, delicate, serious, at once diffident and resolute, yielding and tenacious. An idealist forced to be a realist, a man of thought painfully learning to be a man of action. He was thin and pale and suffered from a poor digestion. He ate little, drank less, and outlived the strong men around him by abstinence and the regularity of his life. Late in March of 44, a freedman arrived at Apollonia, in Illyria, where Octavian was stationed with the army, and brought the news of Caesar's death and will. The sensitive youth was horrified at men's ingratitude. All his love for the great uncle who had so cherished him and had worked so feverishly to rebuild a shattered state welled up in him and filled him with a silent resolve to complete the labors of Caesar and avenge his death. He rode down to the sea, crossed to Brundisium, and hastened to Rome. His relatives there advised him to stay in hiding lest Antony destroy him. His mother likewise recommended inaction. But when he scorned such a course, she rejoiced, merely suggesting that whenever possible he should use patience and subtlety rather than open war. He followed this wise counsel to the end. He visited Antony and inquired what was being done against Caesar's enemies. He was shocked to find Antony busy planning to lead an army against Decimus Brutus, who had refused to surrender Cisalpine Gaul. He asked Antony to disburse Caesar's legacies according to will, especially the $45 bequeathed to every citizen. Antony saw many reasons for delay. Octavian thereupon distributed the money to Caesar's veterans out of funds borrowed by him from Caesar's friends, and with this approach organized his own army. Infuriated by the insolence of this boy, as he called him, Antony announced that an attempt had been made upon his life, and that the would-be assassin had named Octavian as the instigator of his plan. Octavian protested his innocence. Cicero took advantage of the quarrel to persuade him that Antony was a ruffian who must be defeated. Octavian agreed, joined his 2 legions with those of the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, and marched with them northward to battle Antony. Cicero lent this new civil war the aid of his invective in 14 powerful Philippics against the public policy and private life of Antony, some delivered to the Senate or the Assembly, the rest published as propaganda broadcasts in the best tradition of martial blackening. In the ensuing engagement at Mutina, now Modena, Antony lost and fled, this in 44, but Hirtius and Pansa fell, and Octavian returned to Rome sole commander of the Senate's legions as well as his own. With this force behind him, he compelled the Senate to name him consul, to repeal its amnesty to the conspirators, and to sentence them all to death. Discovering that Cicero and the Senate were now his enemies and were merely using him as a temporary tool against Antony, he composed his differences with Antony and formed with him and Lepidus the second triumvirate, this from 43 to 33. Their combined armies marched into Rome and took it without resistance. Many of the senators and conservatives fled to South Italy and the provinces. The Assembly ratified the triumvirate and gave it full power for 5 years. To pay their troops, replenish their coffers, and revenge Caesar, the three men now let loose the bloodiest reign of terror in Roman history. They listed 300 senators and 2,000 businessmen for execution, and offered 25,000 drachmas, or $15,000, to any freeman, and 10,000 to any slave who would bring in the head of a person proscribed. To have money became a capital crime. Children to whom fortunes had been left were condemned and killed. Widows were shorn of their legacies. 1,400 rich women were required to turn over a large share of their property to the triumvirs. At last even the savings deposited with the Vestal virgins were seized. Atticus was spared because he had helped Antony's wife Fulvia. While acknowledging the courtesy, he sent great sums to Brutus and Cassius. The triumvirs set their soldiers to guard all exits from the city. The proscribed hid in wells, sewers, attics, chimneys. Some died resisting, some submitted quietly to their slayers. Some starved, hanged, or drowned themselves. Some leaped from a roof or into a fire. Some were killed by mistake. Some, not proscribed, committed suicide on the bodies of slain relatives. Salvius, the tribune, knowing himself doomed, gave a last feast to his friends. The emissaries of the triumvirs entered, cut off his head, left his body at the table, and bade the feast go on. Slaves took the opportunity to get rid of hard masters, but many fought to the death to protect their owners. One disguised himself as his master and suffered decapitation in his stead. Sons died to protect their fathers, others betrayed their fathers to inherit a part of their fortunes. Adulterers or deceived wives surrendered their husbands. The wife of Coponius secured his safety by sleeping with Antony. Antony's wife Fulvia had tried to buy the mansion of her neighbor Rufus. He had refused to sell. Now, though he offered it to her as a gift, she had him proscribed and nailed his severed head to his front door. Antony placed Cicero high on the list of those who should be killed. Antony was the husband of Clodius's widow and the stepson of the Catilinarian Lentulus, whom Cicero had slain in jail. And he resented with some reason the unstinted vituperation of the Philippics. Octavian protested, but not too long. He could not forget Cicero's glorification of Caesar's assassins and the pun by which that reckless wit had excused to the conservatives his dalliance with Caesar's heir. Cicero tried to escape, but being buffeted and sickened by the sea, he disembarked and spent the night in his villa at Formii. The next day he wished to stay there and await his executioners, preferring them to a choppy sea, but his slaves forced him into a litter and were carrying him toward the ship when Antony's soldiers came upon them. The servants wished to resist, but Cicero bade them set the litter down and yield. Then, his person covered with dust, his beard and hair untrimmed, and his face worn with his troubles, he stretched his head out so that the soldiers might more conveniently decapitate him, this in 43. By Antony's command, Cicero's right hand was also cut off and brought with the head to the triumvir. Antony laughed in triumph, gave the assassins 250,000 drachmas, and had head and hand hung up in the forum. Early in 42, the triumvirs led their forces across the Adriatic and marched through Macedonia into Thrace. There Brutus and Cassius had massed the last Republican army, financed by exactions beyond even Roman precedent. From the eastern cities of the empire they demanded and received 10 years' taxes in advance. When the Rhodians proved reluctant, Cassius stormed the great port, ordered all citizens to surrender their wealth, killed those who hesitated, and carried away $10 million. In Cilicia he quartered his soldiers in the homes of Tarsus till it paid him $9 million to leave. To raise this sum, the citizens auctioned off all municipal lands, melted down all temple vessels and ornaments, and sold free persons into slavery. First boys and girls, then women and old men, finally youths. Many, on learning that they had been sold, killed themselves. In Judea, Cassius levied $4,200,000 and sold the inhabitants of 4 towns into slavery. Brutus, too, could raise money by force. When the citizens of Lycian Xanthus refused his demands, he besieged them until, starving but obdurate, they committed suicide en masse. For the most part, Brutus, loving philosophy, tarried in Athens, but the city was filling with young Roman nobles clamoring for a war of restoration. When sufficient funds had been raised, Brutus closed his books, joined his troops with those of Cassius, and took the field. The rival armies met at Philippi in September of 42. Brutus's wing forced back Octavian's and captured his camp, but Antony's routed the legions of Cassius. Cassius ordered his shield-bearer to kill him and was obeyed. Antony could not follow up his success at once. Octavian was confined to his tent with illness, and his troops were in disorder. Antony reorganized the whole army, and after a few days' rest led them against Brutus and put the last remnants of the Republican forces to flight. Seeing his men yield, Brutus realized, perhaps with relief, that all was lost. He threw himself upon the sword of a friend and died. Antony, coming upon the body, covered it with his own purple robe. They had once been friends. 2. Antony and Cleopatra. The old aristocracy fought its last land battle at Philippi. Many of them, Cato's son, Hortensius's son, Quintilius Varus, and Quintus Labio, joined Brutus and Cassius in suicide. The victors divided the empire between them. Lepidus was given Africa, Octavian took the west, Antony, having his choice, took Egypt, Greece, and the east. Always needing money, Antony forgave the eastern cities their contributions to his enemies on condition that they give him a like sum, 10 years' taxes within a year. His old geniality returned as victory made him seemingly secure. He reduced his demands upon the Ephesians when their women, dressed as bacchantes, greeted him as the god Dionysus, but he gave his cook the house of a Magnesian magnate as reward for a distinguished supper. He called an assembly of the Ionian cities at Ephesus and settled the boundaries and affairs of these states with such good judgment that Augustus a decade later found little to change. He pardoned all who had fought against him except those who had shared in killing Caesar. He gave relief to the cities that had suffered most severely from Cassius and Brutus, released several of them from every Roman tax, freed many who had been sold into slavery by the conspirators, and liberated the cities of Syria from the despots who had overthrown their democracies. While displaying these graces of his simple character, Antony surrendered to such exuberant sensuality that his subjects lost respect for his authority. He surrounded himself with dancers, musicians, courtesans, and roisterers, and took wives and concubines whenever a fair woman struck his Olympian fancy. He had sent messengers to bid Cleopatra present herself before him at Tarsus and answer charges that she had aided Cassius to raise money and troops. She came, but in her own time and way. While Antony sat on a throne in the Forum, waiting for her to plead and be judged, she sailed up the river Cydnus in a barge with purple sails, gilded stern, and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. Her maids, dressed as sea-nymphs and graces, were the crew, while she herself, dressed as Venus, lay under a canopy of cloth of gold. When the news of this seductive apparition spread among the people of Tarsus, they flocked to the shore, leaving Antony solitary on his throne. Cleopatra invited him to dine with her on her ship. He came with an overawing retinue. She feted them with every luxury, and corrupted his generals with gifts and smiles. Antony had almost fallen in love with her as a girl in Alexandria. Now he found her at 29 in the full maturity of her charms. He began by reproving her, and ended by presenting her with Phoenicia, Cilicia, Cyprus, and parts of Arabia, Cilicia, and Judea. She rewarded him according to his desire and invited him to Alexandria. There he spent a carefree winter, from 41 to 40, drinking the queen's love, listening to lectures at the museum, and forgetting that he had an empire to rule. She herself was not in love. She knew that Egypt, rich but weak, would soon attract the cupidity of omnipotent Rome. The only salvation for her country and her throne lay in marriage with Rome's lord. She had sought this with Caesar. She sought it now with Antony. And he, who had no policy but Caesar's, was tempted to realize the dream of uniting Rome and Egypt and making his capital in the fascinating East. While Antony frolicked in Alexandria, his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius were plotting to overthrow Octavian's power in Rome. Octavian had found no happiness there. The Senate was a rump of adventurers and generals, labor was restless with unemployment, the populares were disorganized, Sextus Pompey was blocking the import of food, business was petrified with fear, taxation and spoliation had ruined nearly every fortune, and many men were living in a reckless and sensual riot on the ground that the morrow might in any case bring repudiation of the currency, or further spoliation, or death. Octavian himself was anything but an exemplar of chastity at this time. To perfect the confusion, Fulvia and Lucius raised an army and called upon Italy to oust him. Marcus Agrippa, Octavian's general, besieged Lucius in Perugia and starved him out, this in March of 40. Fulvia died of illness, frustrated ambition, and grief over Antony's neglect of her. Octavian pardoned Lucius in the hope of maintaining peace with Antony, but Antony crossed the sea and besieged Octavian's troops in Brundisium. The armies, showing more sense than their leaders, refused to fight each other and compelled them to a peaceable agreement in 40. As a pledge of good behavior, Antony married Octavian's sister, the gentle and virtuous Octavia. Everybody was briefly happy, and Virgil, writing now his 4th eclogue, predicted the return of Saturn's utopian reign. In 38, Octavian fell in love with Livia, the pregnant wife of Tiberius Claudius Nero. He divorced his first wife, Scribonia, persuaded Nero to release Livia, married her, and found, in her persuasive counsel and her aristocratic connections as a member of the Claudian gens, a passage to reconciliation with the propertied classes. He reduced taxes, returned 30,000 runaway slaves to their masters, and set himself patiently to restoring order in Italy. With the help of Agrippa and of 120 ships contributed by Antony, he destroyed the fleet of Sextus Pompey, secured Rome's food supply, and ended the resistance of the Pompeians, this in 36. The Senate, by acclamation, named him tribune for life. After marrying Octavia in a state ceremony at Rome, Antony went with her to Athens. There for a time he enjoyed the novel experience of living with a good woman. He put aside politics and war and, with Octavia at his side, attended the lectures of philosophers. Meanwhile, however, he studied the plans that Caesar had left for conquering Parthia. Labienus, son of Caesar's general, had entered the services of the Parthian king and had led Parthian armies victoriously into Cilicia and Syria, lucrative provinces of Rome, this in 40. To meet this threat, Antony needed soldiers. To pay soldiers, he needed money, and of this Cleopatra had plenty. Suddenly tiring of virtue and peace, he sent Octavia back to Rome and asked Cleopatra to meet him at Antioch. She brought him a few troops, but she disapproved of his grandiose plans, and apparently gave him little of her fabulous treasury. He invaded Parthia with 100,000 men in 36, tried in vain to capture its citadels, and lost almost half his forces in a heroic retreat through 300 miles of hostile country. On the way he annexed Armenia to the empire. He awarded himself a triumph and shocked Italy by celebrating it at Alexandria. He sent a letter of divorce to Octavia in 32, married Cleopatra, confirmed her and Caesarion as joint rulers of Egypt and Cyprus, and bequeathed the eastern provinces of the empire to the son and daughter that Cleopatra had borne him. Knowing that he would soon have to square accounts with Octavian, he abandoned himself to a year of frolic and luxury. Cleopatra encouraged him to dare the last gamble for omnipotence, helped him to raise an army and a fleet, and chose as her favorite oath, "As surely as I shall one day give judgment in the Capitol." 3. Antony and Octavian. Octavia bore her rejection silently, lived quietly in Antony's house at Rome, and brought up faithfully his children by Fulvia and the 2 daughters that she herself had given him. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.